I was the delivery lead on a supply chain integration program that everyone kept calling a clean outsource. We had an aging ERP, a warehouse system that spoke its own dialect, and a new planning platform the sponsor wanted live before peak season. The vendor we hired was, honestly, competent. Their consultants showed up on time. Their project plan had real dependencies. Their documentation wasn't theatre. They did what was in scope, and they did it well. What made it feel clean was everything I did around them. I wrote the handover pack the way I wished someone had done it for me years ago. Data dictionaries, interface maps, and a list of if this fails, call this person contacts. I ran a walkthrough of our receiving process, including the parts no one liked to admit were still manual. I sat with their integration engineer and replayed 2 years of why does this field look wrong incidents, so they wouldn't waste their first month rediscovering them. I took the messy history and turned it into a sequence of steps that looked inevitable. When procurement asked how the vendor was onboarding, I sent a bullet list of artifacts: access requests submitted, environments verified, test data prepared, integration endpoints confirmed. When PMO asked about risk, I answered with dates and mitigations, not feelings. When finance asked why my time was still on the charge code, I said transition support per the handover plan, and kept going. From the outside, it looked like we had finally learned how to outsource. The vendor ran the sprint reviews like clockwork. Their lead consultant said, acceptance criteria, as if it was a comfort object. The sponsor, Martin, head of ops, the kind of person who could make standardization sound like a moral value, liked them immediately. We're paying for experts, he said in the first steering meeting. We just need to stay out of the way and let them execute. I didn't argue. I just kept making sure nothing snagged. Every week my inbox collected the small things that weren't anyone's job. Exactly. A customer-side contact asking for a status update in plain language. A warehouse supervisor sending a screenshot of a scanner error at 5:40 p.m. A vendor consultant asking if our security team really needed evidence for a firewall change that was already approved in the plan. Those were the seams, the glue work, the pieces that never appeared in a contract because no one thought to write them down as work. I was the person everyone assumed would handle them, because I always had. By week 3, the sponsor started speaking in scope statements. If it's not in the statement of work, Martin said, it's a change request. We're not paying for extras. He said it like he was protecting the company, and he wasn't wrong. The contract was crisp, deliverables were listed, acceptance tests were defined. The vendor's plan matched the paper. He liked saying out of contract the way some people like saying facts. The vendor's lead nodded. Professional, agreeable, will follow the process. Anything beyond scope will raise a change. PMO wrote it down. Everyone around the table nodded, including me. It sounded reasonable, the way rules always do when they're spoken in a meeting room. After that, anything that didn't fit neatly inside a deliverable became invisible. It still had to happen. It just didn't have a name. The first time it came up, it was small. The vendor needed a sample of live shipment data to validate an interface mapping. The contract assumed test data provided by client. Our data wasn't in a shape anyone would call provided. It lived across 3 systems with different identifiers and an informal spreadsheet. The warehouse analyst maintained like a personal diary. Martin forwarded me the vendor's request with one line. Can you send them what they need? You know where it is. It didn't read like an order. It read like common sense. I pulled the sample myself. I masked what needed masking. I added a note about the one supplier whose ASN format didn't match the standard. I sent it to the vendor and CC'd Martin so it looked like the client organization was efficient. No one said thank you. No one needed to. This was just how it worked. The second time, it wasn't about data. It was about evidence. Our customer counterpart, Lena, a senior manager on the client side, had been friendly but precise. She didn't care about our internal politics. She cared about what she could show her auditors and her warehouse leaders. When she asked for a traceability pack for a particular transaction flow, she wasn't being difficult. She was doing her job. The contract didn't mention traceability pack. It mentioned integration tested and user acceptance supported. Martin treated the request the way he treated anything that didn't have a line item. We're not in the business of writing extra documentation, he said in the weekly sync. Eyes on the agenda. If they want more, that's a scope increase. Legal was on the call, silent. PMO was on the call, typing. The vendor was on the call, politely waiting. Lena didn't argue. She asked, "So what do I show my team while we're waiting for the change request?" Martin's answer came out smooth. "The acceptance criteria. That's what we agreed." It sounded correct. It also sounded like a door closing. After the meeting, I built the traceability pack anyway. Not a full document, just enough. Screenshots, log snippets, a mapping table that linked the fields between systems. I sent it to Lena with a short note and copied the vendor so they could reuse it. I didn't copy Martin. The program stayed smooth. The sponsor stayed confident. Finance stayed happy with the burn rate. It was on paper the best outsourcing story we'd had in years. Then the third time came. The vendor had finished a key interface build early. They were ready to move into an end-to-end test across the ERP, the warehouse system, and the planning platform. The test window was booked. The warehouse leadership had agreed to a late shift. Lena had arranged her team to be available. On the vendor side, it was all lined up. On our side, there was one missing piece, a security exception that needed an evidence chain, not approval. The approval was already there, signed off in the change board minutes. What was missing was the proof bundle, the screenshots, the ticket numbers, the confirmation that the firewall rules were applied in the correct environment and that the test data path matched what had been approved. It was the kind of thing no one thought about until an auditor asked for it. The security team had a process, a form, a checklist, and an internal ticket category. No one outside their team understood. It wasn't difficult, it was just specific. I had done it enough times that I could assemble the bundle in an hour if I had to. In the Thursday steering meeting, Martin looked at the vendor's early completion, like it was a personal victory. "This is exactly why we outsource," he said. "Professional delivery, predictable outcomes, no heroics." He turned to me when the security exception was mentioned. "Can you just take care of that? Like you always do. We can't delay testing over paperwork." He didn't mean it as disrespect. It was the opposite. It was certainty. PMO was on the call. Procurement was on the call. Lena was on the call. Legal was on the call. Muted. The vendor's lead consultant was on the call, ready to log a task. Everyone waited for me to say yes, because the program had been built on the assumption that I would. I didn't say anything. After the call, the vendor's consultant sent me a message. "Hey, can you confirm the security evidence bundle steps? We didn't see it in the handover docs." It wasn't in the handover pack, not explicitly. I'd kept it in my head, like I always did. It was faster that way. It kept people from panicking about a compliance process they didn't understand. I opened the handover folder, the one I had built for them, and searched for security exception evidence. There was nothing. I replied with one sentence, "Please follow the documented handover and raise a ticket per process." I didn't add a smiley. I didn't add context. I didn't attach the checklist I kept in my own notes. I didn't tell them the shortcut. A few minutes later, Lena emailed the group, asking who to coordinate with for the evidence chain so her team could confirm readiness for the end-to-end test window. Martin replied quickly, copying PMO, procurement, and the vendor. "This is out of vendor scope. Internal compliance follows internal process. Delivery will coordinate per the handover." He didn't name me. He didn't need to. It was implied. The thread stayed open on my screen for a full minute. I didn't answer it. The meeting invites for the end-to-end test remained on everyone's calendars, like a promise that had already been made. No one updated them. By Monday morning, the test window was still technically on. The warehouse supervisors had confirmed staffing. The vendor had deployed their build to the test environment. Lena's team had blocked their calendars. Nothing had been cancelled because nothing had been formally stopped. It was just waiting on one prerequisite that no one had named as a blocker. PMO sent a neutral check-in. "Can we confirm readiness for E2E testing?" The vendor replied with a status table. Green across the board, except one line item, client-side security evidence pending. No one assigned an owner. An hour later, procurement forwarded the thread to me. "Is this something we should raise as a change?" I didn't answer that either. Instead, I updated the delivery tracker, factually and without commentary. Under dependencies, I wrote, "Security evidence per internal process, not completed." The tracker auto-synced to the shared dashboard. That afternoon, Lena called a short alignment meeting. She kept it tight. "I just need to understand timing. If the evidence isn't ready, do we move the test, or is there a workaround?" Martin joined late, breathless and confident. There shouldn't be a delay. We've done these before. He looked at the vendor. Can you proceed while this gets sorted? The vendor's lead consultant didn't say yes. He didn't say no either. He said, per acceptance criteria, we need confirmation that all prerequisites are met before executing the test. It was exactly the right answer. It was also useless. PMO jumped in. Could we provisionally run part of the test? Maybe validate the data flow without the full security sign-off? Legal unmuted. If it's logged as provisional, it creates an audit artifact. That's not ideal. The room went quiet. For a moment, it looked like someone might just decide to take the risk anyway. That was usually how these things resolved. Someone saying, let's just move forward and dealing with the paperwork later. Martin glanced at me, then away. We'll follow process, he said. Let's not create problems we don't need. The meeting ended without a decision. The calendar invite stayed. By Tuesday, the test window had technically started. The vendor logged in, confirmed connections, and waited. The warehouse team stood by on their late shift. Lena's analyst sent a message, asking if they should begin capturing logs. No one replied. At 7:45 p.m., the vendor posted an update, standing by for confirmation to proceed. At 8:15 p.m., PMO asked if the session should be officially postponed. Martin responded with a thumbs-up reaction. Not a written answer, just the reaction. The vendor marked the test as not executed, dependency unmet. It didn't feel dramatic, it felt procedural. The next day, finance noticed the slip. They didn't ask about the evidence, they asked about burn. If the vendor is idle during a booked test window, do we still incur cost? Procurement replied first. Per contract, vendor availability during scheduled testing is billable. It was the kind of sentence that didn't accuse anyone and still made the number real. Martin forwarded the thread to me. Can we accelerate the compliance piece? This is becoming visible. I read it, then filed the message. An hour later, Lena forwarded me a separate email chain. Her audit team was asking why an end-to-end test had been booked, staffed, and then not executed. They wanted a root cause, not in narrative form, but in bullets. She didn't accuse, she asked where to direct the questions. I didn't answer her either. PMO tried to fix it by rebooking. They proposed a new test window 2 weeks out. The vendor accepted, with a note that it would require revalidation of the environment. The warehouse team said they'd need new approvals for overtime. Lena said she'd have to reconfirm availability. Legal asked for the incident to be logged, for traceability. That was the first time the word incident appeared in writing. Someone suggested a workaround. What if we used the old evidence from last quarter? Legal shook their head. Different environment, different data, different approval context. PMO looked at me. Is there any reason we can't reuse it? I said nothing. The workaround died on its own. By the end of the week, there were more meetings about the missed test than there had been about building the interface. People started using careful language, dependency misalignment, ownership clarification needed, process adherence impact. No one said my name, but no one filled the gap either. On Friday afternoon, Martin called a short internal huddle. No vendor, no client, just UMPS, PMO, legal, and me. We need to be clear on roles, he said. We can't afford ambiguity. Legal was blunt. From a compliance standpoint, the evidence chain is internal. It always has been. PMO added, from a delivery standpoint, it wasn't listed as a task owner in the handover. Martin nodded, as if this was a revelation. So who owns it? He asked. The room didn't look at me. They looked at the process map. There was a box labeled Client-Side Compliance Verification. No name under it. The meeting ended with an action item to define ownership and a follow-up scheduled for the next week. The calendar invite went out with an empty description. No one accepted it right away. The following week started with documentation, not new work, just records catching up to reality. PMO updated the risk log. E2E testing dependency. Unresolved ownership. It wasn't flagged red, just amber, the kind of color that asked questions without forcing answers. The dashboard refreshed. Notifications went out to everyone who had ever subscribed to the program. Kalena replied with a single line, "Please advise how this impacts revised timeline." No one answered her directly. Instead, a meeting was scheduled, then another. The first was about scope alignment. The second was about compliance sequencing. The third was about lessons learned, even though nothing had officially failed. In one meeting, someone suggested formalizing what had always been informal. Maybe we should add a small internal work stream. Finance asked how it would be funded. Legal asked how it would be governed. PMO asked who would staff it. The conversation circled itself until the hour ended. Meanwhile, the vendor kept delivering exactly what they had promised. Their next milestone hit on time. Their acceptance documents were clean. They logged their hours. They sent the invoice. Procurement approved it without comment. The cost showed up in the monthly report, within forecast. The missed test showed up as a footnote. Lena's audit team followed up again, this time copying her director. The question was the same: why a committed test window had not produced evidence. PMO drafted a response. It went through 3 revisions. Each revision removed a name. Each revision added a phrase like cross-functional dependency or process clarification in progress. By the time it went out, it answered everything except the actual question. I stayed out of the threads. I updated my tasks. I attended the meetings I was invited to. When someone asked me to just help move this along, I pointed them back to the tracker. Pair process, I said once. It was enough. The security team eventually completed the evidence bundle. Not quickly, but correctly. They followed their checklist. They attached screenshots. They logged the ticket. It took longer than anyone liked. By the time it was done, the original test window was a memory, and the rescheduled one was already under scrutiny. The warehouse asked if the overtime approval was still valid. The vendor asked if the environment needed to be revalidated. Lena asked if her team should still prepare the same artifacts. Each question landed in a different inbox. No one stitched them together. In the next steering meeting, Martin spoke less. He didn't defend the process. He didn't attack it either. He asked PMO for status. He listened to legal's caution. He nodded at finance's numbers. When the revised timeline came up, there was an asterisk. "What's that?" he asked. PMO answered carefully. "That's the dependency we discussed. It's being addressed, but it's now on the critical path." Martin leaned back. Was it always there? No one answered right away. The vendor's lead consultant checked his notes. "From our perspective," he said, "this step was always client-side. It wasn't accusatory, it was factual." Lena looked at the slide, then at Martin. "We just need to know what to plan for," she said. "My team can adapt. We just need clarity." Martin nodded slowly. "Understood." After the meeting, he sent a message proposing a working session to streamline internal compliance activities. He didn't tag me. The invite went out with a tentative agenda and a 2-hour block. By the end of the day, legal accepted, PMO accepted, finance accepted. The vendor declined. "Scope," Lena replied. "We'll join if needed." The meeting sat on calendars, half accepted, half pending. The dashboard refreshed again that night. The amber risk stayed amber. The timeline stayed revised. The cost stayed within forecast. Everything was still correct. The next morning, a new request appeared in my inbox. Not urgent, no deadline. It asked if I could support coordination on the upcoming compliance workstream, given historical context. I read it once. I didn't respond. The request stayed unread.